As we get started here, before we actually start diving into the module and into the system, let's discuss a very basic vocabulary set here. So tip pooling versus tip sharing. We need to think about, are we pooling tips or are we sharing tips, or are we doing a mixture of both? Pooling is going to be putting all of our tips into a tip jar and then redistributing all those tips to our employees. Tip sharing is going to be tipping out. So a server gives a portion of their tips to support staff. We're going to want to set up Tips Manager slightly differently, whether or not we're pooling or sharing. We're going to start things off talking about our Tips Manager workflow. How do tips go from being earned on checks to being distributed, shared, pooled between our employees? So the first thing that always happens is that employees are going to earn tips and gratuities. Every time an employee uses their clock in code and starts a shift on the Toast point of sale, they're going to ring in checks. And those checks and tabs are going to have tips associated with them. Whether or not that's a credit card tip or it's any cash tips the server entered at the time of their shift review when they're closing things out, all of those tips and gratuities are earned underneath that employee's profile. So that's really important to remember, is the employee that's currently clocked in, the tips that are associated with those checks go to that employee. In order to make sure that these tips can be included in the Tips Manager module, there's a couple of things we need to make sure happen in order for proper calculations. Firstly, all employees must complete shift reviews daily. Making sure that employees close their shifts will actually allow Tips Manager to use the tips that were collected during said shift. If we don't close the shift, those tips might not be included. We also want to make sure that all time entries are accurate. So if an employee forgets to clock out, we want to make sure that we make corrections to those. The second thing that's going to occur is those tips that are earned by employees are going to actually funnel into what we call a tip policy. Tip policies are something that we build within the greater Tips Manager module. A policy, we can have one, we can have many of them, are a set of customized rules that tell Toast where to allocate the tips and who to give those tips to. This is the real meat and potatoes of the Tips Manager module, is our policies. And then to finally distribute those tips to our employees, we're going to review the final amounts in our Tips Manager reports. So this allows us to review tip receipts for each day and confirm they are accurate, and then ultimately recorded in payroll. If we're using Toast Payroll, we can directly sync those tips and those final amounts to our Toast Payroll system to be recorded and or paid on paychecks. And then if we're not using Toast Payroll, we're going to download and export for third-party payroll providers so we can upload that to an ADP, for example. This all happens in the background automatically. The only manual part is to initiate the link to Toast Payroll and sending those tips over, or downloading the export. Everything else happens automatically. It's going to help us save time and effort. When it comes to what tips are actually included in Tips Manager, there's 4 different types of tips that we can be aware of. So any cash tips. Employees declare cash tips during their shift review. Non-cash tips, aka credit card tips. Also tips like gift card tips, house account. Cash gratuity and credit card gratuity. So gratuities come from the service charges that we create within Toast. And if they are set up as gratuities, those act similar to tips. These happen technically on 2 separate pages within Toast. Both pages are what we consider Tips Manager. If we navigate into Toast Web, let's first find our rules page, our policy page. I always find the search bar to be the most efficient way to find these pages. All we need to do is just search for tip in the search bar, and then it's going to provide us with all the pages that we need that are tip related. Tip pooling policy is going to be our first page using Tips Manager. This is where we create our customized rules. Once we save these settings, they're automatically going to share those tips that are calculated by employees. And that brings us to the second page of Tips Manager. We'll just search for tip. Now we're going to navigate into tip management. Tip management is the second part of Tips Manager. This is our final review page. This is where we see who receives how many tips. It's where we download our reports to send into our third-party providers, or it's where we send these tips directly to Toast Payroll. So if we look on Thursday the 14th, we can see all of our employees that worked that day, how many tips they earned before pooling, and then how many they received after pooling and sharing. We can even click into individual employees to see all of their details. This is especially helpful if we're just setting up our policy for the first time and trying to get the math exactly right. And then we see that final total amount. If we determine that these calculations are incorrect, the beauty about Tips Manager is that we can retroactively adjust these. Once we're happy with the distribution of tips, we can either download an entire day's worth of tips, or we can send this individual day to payroll. This is again only going to appear if we have Toast payroll. Sending to payroll will send those tips over, and they're going to land in our payroll timesheets, getting ready to prepare those for payroll. We can use the date function at the top of our tip management homepage and then either download multiple days, or we can send multiple days to payroll as well. Employees themselves will not be able to see their final tip total until they see it on their paycheck. This tip management report is only available to those who have labor report permissions, so typically managers in Toast Web. What the employee sees on their shift review is just what they earn during their shift. That is pre-pooling and pre-sharing. Tip pooling policy is going to be the most customizable page. This is where we create all of our rules. We can see that there's multiple policies on this page. When I am referencing a policy, I am referencing this box on the screen. There's different rules that dictate how these tips are going to be allocated. So a server is giving their tips to hosts, busters, and runners, and it's a pool. There's even a section for advanced settings to further clarify how these tips are shared. Now, this might look like a lot. So what we're going to do is go through the settings that are available to us and how we set up these different settings. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is our tip policy interval. It's located at the very top of our tip pooling policy page. We will select one of these three options for our entire point of sale location. Full workday is the first one. This option uses the entire day of business, all the tips earned, all of the hours worked, all of the employees that clocked in and out. This is the most common setup just because it accounts for everything in the whole day. There's different ways that we can break it up if we'd like. By shift is going to allow us to cut up that day into specific sections, aka shifts. We can create options for shifts that are set into specific time frames. Order is the most flexible option because this allows us to actually look at the exact time a check is opened and who is clocked in at that moment. Only employees that are currently working at that time will receive a portion of those tips from that check. It does allow us to really look and say, hey, maybe when we first open the bar, there's only one bartender, they get all the tips. But later on in that night, when we have 3 bartenders working, they split the tips accordingly. Very big caveat with Order is that it does not currently utilize cash tips or cash sales in our calculations. So if we want those to be a part of our shared amounts for tips, we want to make sure that we avoid Order. Again, we choose one for the whole location, then every single policy follows these same rules. If we have multiple locations, we can differentiate these for each location. We're on then to contributors and receivers. Contributors and receivers are always going to be jobs. This is an example of a pool. So in this case, our contributor job is a server. Servers are putting all of their money into the policy. Quick note about contributors as well. It doesn't have to be jobs that actual employees clock in as. It could be things like salaried employees. It could be shared bar job or shared jobs in general. If we use all the same clock in code to collect tips, that can be used as a contributor job. Now, receivers, the flip side of it is going to be who receives tips. So going back into our example, we have 3. So we have a host, buster/runner, and then servers. I always like to imagine this line between our contributors and receivers is like the tip jar. Servers are putting all of their tips into the tip jar, and then these jobs are going to receive those tips. They're going to take money out. If we had any other jobs collecting tips and we want them to be included in the pool, we can do that. Tip distribution. How do we actually dictate the specific slices of that tip pie? This can be set up as points or percentages. Points calculations is going to look a little something like this. Points assigned multiplied by hours worked equals tip shares. Total tips divided by total shares equals the tip dollar amount per share. So for instance, if we go back to our example here, busser/runner receives 2 points. If I work as a busser and runner and I work for 6 hours and I receive 2 points, I receive 12 shares from this policy. Now, adding up the total amount of shares, maybe there's 50 total shares in this policy, that is going to calculate $20 per share. $20 per share times 12 or times 15 equates to how much I take home. This is a really good setup to use when we don't always have recipient jobs clocked in. So even if busser and runner didn't clock in or a host didn't clock in, everything's going to be reallocated to the other jobs that did clock in. Now, the other side of it is going to be to use percentages. It's cutting up pieces of a pie. If we were to go back to our pool example, I change this to percentages, we might want to change this to like a 25, 50% makeup. Imagining how much of this 100% total pie we want to give out to hosts, bussers, runners, or servers. When we look at the math calculation again, this is going to be total tips multiplied by each job's assigned percentage. So $1,000 times 75% equals $750. If someone wasn't there to claim tips as a recipient job, no one was clocked in as our busser or host, those tips that they were supposed to receive go back to the contributor. If a host does not clock in, this 25% goes back to the server. Are we having recipient jobs always clock in? If not, we recommend using points. If we are going to have all these jobs clocked in all of the time, percentages can be a perfectly viable way to distribute those. Dividing tips among employees. Well, there's 2 ways. Proportionally by hours worked or equally regardless of hours worked. Employees who work more hours will receive a greater share of the tip pool. This is dictated on an hourly rate. And then equally, regardless of hours worked, this is going to be employees with the same job are going to just split that total amount, that total recipient percentage or points right down the middle. So we talked about pooling tips. If we go to this server tip share to the bar, this is going to look a little bit different. And a share is giving a portion of their tips that are earned to another job. So in this case, servers are giving a portion, 8% of their tips to bartenders. Now, it's not 8% of their total tips in this case. No, we have changed it a little bit for the source. We can actually assign the source as a percentage of sales a server earned. So in this case, the server is collecting tips, they're making sales, maybe on bar drinks as part of their sales. So in order to make sure we give a proportionate amount of tips to bartenders, we can calculate the tip share based off of how much a server did in beer sales, liquor sales, wine sales. So that might be 8% of $1,000 in bar sales. We can give that $80 then to bartenders in tips. Now you'll notice that bartender is the only recipient job here. If we went down to advanced options, if we change between points and percentages, nothing happens. That is by default because points and percentages just allows us to split up this 8% into separate chunks. But as soon as we only have one recipient job, bartender just gets the whole thing. So there's no need to add those in. And then beneath that, we get to choose, are these tips proportionally by hours worked distributed between bartenders or equally regardless of hours worked? This is going to be really important to be mindful of. As we scroll down, we have another example of a bartender pool. This will allow the bartender to, again, because it's a pool, contribute all of their tips and gratuities into this policy. So barbacks receive a point amount and bartenders receive a point amount. Please note that our source here, we'll see that we have 100% of all of the tips and gratuities earned by employees selected. Sales categories is not selected. We should never see all 5 of these selected at the same time. Reason being is that it fundamentally is calculating our tip share and tip pools differently when we choose all of these between a percentage of tips or a percentage of sales. We need to make sure it is either some variation of the first 4 or only the last one. We should never see all 5 of those checked off at the same time. Scrolling down, quick service pools. If we are quick service, we might be using cashiers. We can replace cashier with bartender. Whoever is going to be collecting tips. In this case, it's probably cashiers. If we use a shared cashier number, we can enter that as a contributor. But we're going to want to pool all these tips together. So we're going to say that a cashier contributes 100% of all of their tips earned. Now, we also need to be mindful of who else is collecting tips. We might have a manager, maybe an hourly manager, maybe it's a general manager that collects tips because they help and kind of step in. If we do not specifically tell tips manager to add in those manager tips, to add in those salary tips, they're not going to get shared in our policy. So that's an important thing to remember when creating contributor parts of policies. We can see that cashier is our primary, but salaried employees such as our managers might also collect some tips. We can set them as a contributor. If we have an hourly manager, we can add them in, and then we'll put in the recipients. It's only cashiers and cooks receiving those. So we're taking those tips away from managers and still giving them to our hourly employees, our cashiers or cooks. I know some quick service examples also use a tip jar. Maybe if we're full service and we do have a bar, we can add in tip jar here too. So this tip jar is an example of how we might want to collect and distribute cash tips in a jar. Cash tips are only ever going to be included in Tips Manager if they are declared by someone. So we can say 100% of all of the cash tips filed under this employee's profile go to bussers, cooks, cashiers, dishwashers. One last note I'll make here for online ordering. If we do enable online ordering, we can set up a specific online ordering pool at the top. This will be specific to our contributors being blocked in as online ordering. This means that this contributor is just whoever we select within our takeout and delivery settings to receive online ordering tips. So we might want to say all of an employee's tips and gratuities that are earned go to cooks, dishwashers, or what have you. Let's go back into our tip management page. In the top right-hand corner, we will see a send to payroll button. No matter if we're using Toast Payroll or a third-party payroll provider, we are always going to see that send to payroll button replaced with complete setup. This is our first time on this page. We are always going to see complete setup. It's important that we do click on this to complete this setup wizard. A wizard is just a series of steps to make sure that our system is ready to use Tips Manager. The first thing that we're going to see is our shift review settings for Tips Manager. This is where we can go in to make sure shift review settings are properly aligned with Tips Manager needs. Every time an employee closes out their day, they should be completing a shift review. There are settings in Toast that allow us as managers to choose between, are these tips going to be paid out in cash at the end of the night, or are they going to be paid out in payroll? If we are using Tips Manager and we have this module enabled, we are always going to mark gratuity and non-cash tips as pay out through payroll. Tips Manager will also restrict our ability to negatively declare cash tips. This is only ever used if we're sharing tips and not using the Tips Manager module, so we should never be able to use our negative declared cash tips field. Once we press the continue button, this will move us into our earning code step. And this is important to note that it's only for Toast Payroll users. This earning code step will allow us to properly configure how our tips are recorded in Toast Payroll. An earning code basically dictates how a tip amount is going to be paid and earned on the employee's paycheck. And there's two choices that we get. We can either pay these out in cash or through payroll. And we're going to mark the earning codes accordingly depending on how we're paying those out. Tips paid is an earning code that signifies we pay the employee their tips in cash outside of their paycheck. Marking that properly as tips paid, aka already paid, it's really important to make sure that we don't double pay the employee on their paycheck. We'll also see an earning code for tips owed. This is if we're paying our tips through payroll on their paycheck. So they will be earned and taxed on the paycheck whenever we mark them as tips owed. So customize this depending on how we pay out tips. If all of our tips go on to employee paychecks, mark all of these as owed. We owe all of the tips to the employee still on their paycheck. So we should never see paid here. If it's the opposite, if we're paying everything in cash, make sure to mark these as paid. And then the last step here is going to be a notice for how we're going to get started with using Tips Manager. So now that we set up our earning codes, Tips Manager will tell us that, hey, you're going to be receiving those pooled tips in Toast Payroll. Because of this, we need to be mindful of if we're switching from a separate sync of tips going into Toast Payroll, we might have tips already in Toast Payroll. So if we are in the middle of a pay period, the Toast system might think that we have tips in Toast Payroll. It's important to make sure that we'll get this little notification and it's letting us know that we need to make sure that we delete any tips before we start sending our Tips Manager tips into Toast Payroll. But if we start at the beginning of a pay period, we will not need to worry about that. So that's our recommendation. Just start using Tips Manager at the start of your next pay period. Let's put it all together. Let's make sure that everything is set up so that we can start using the Tips Manager module. First thing to do, set up our policy rules. Once we have purchased Tips Manager, navigate to our policy page and configure things like tip intervals, contributors and receivers, points or percentages, and proportional or even splits. Once we choose those, make sure to save those policy rules. Then navigate to Tip Management to configure the rest of our Toast web system with our setup wizard, apply our earning codes, and this is a good time to also ensure employee shifts are completed and proper time entries are correct. Once we set up those two steps, it's time to finally review those final amounts, review what employees are receiving, adjust our policy rules if we need to, and then if we're all set, send those tips to payroll. Either directly send them to Toast Payroll, or we can download that report and import them into our third-party system.